Who gazers, and welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, the podcast taking you through the world of the target novelizations in publication order. My name is Jason, and I'm your host on this journey, this very long journey. We have an interesting confluence of events this week. I am recording this bit of the podcast on September 2nd, 2022, 55 years to the day after the premiere of episode 1 of the story that we're going to be discussing, which is The Tomb of the Cybermen, episode 1 of which aired on the 2nd of September 1967, 55 years ago. That was before my lifetime, and it was also before the lifetime of my guest interview today. However, the past of the Tomb of the Cybermen is a very interesting subject, and we will be picking apart and discussing and dissecting that subject in full over the coming 90 minutes or so of the rest of this episode. But first, I've been away, I've been on vacation, I am back. This is the first episode in a little while that I have not pre-recorded. I am recording this very shortly before it goes out. I do not have any listener emails this week to go over with you, but I do have one very nice tweet, and I have one review, which is now available on Chartable. And that review is from Fraser Gregory, friend of the program, a guest back on episode 9 and episode 21, and at least 2 more episodes coming up on my calendar. Fraser gives us a 5-star review on Chartable and says, "Top show. This is hands down the best Dominators-themed podcast I have listened to." Oh, Fraser, he is a card. Yes, this is not a Dominators-themed podcast, but we do talk about the Dominators quite a bit, typically to get Fraser's attention. He is quite a fan of that story. I am a little bit less so, as you may have noticed. Back to the review. Jason has hit on a winning formula of interview, followed by review/breakdown of the book being discussed. But the real USP, and I had to look that one up, I'll tell you, that means unique selling point. Back to the review, but the real USP is the quality of the guests he's assembled. Each one a standout. This has become essential weekly listening. All kidding aside, Fraser, thank you so much for the review and for having been on the show before and for agreeing to be on the show again. Definitely appreciate your support and your retweets and your 5-star review. In addition to that, we also have a tweet from John Featonby, who those of you who listen to the Trap One podcast will be very familiar with. John writes, "Jason is one of the loveliest, most genuine Doctor Who fans there is. And this chat with Steve Alexander, that's last week, episode 40, is a spiffing reminder about why we will always love this silly program." John, thank you so much for your support and your retweet and your comment there. It is much appreciated. Turning to this week's subject, Tomb of the Cybermen was famously discovered almost 25 years after being thought lost in Hong Kong in 1992, and a commercial release soon followed. I bought this at Suncoast Video. Those of you who remember in the States, Suncoast Video was a shopping mall chain. You could not enter a shopping mall without seeing a Suncoast Video. A large room full of all the VHS tapes in the world, and usually a TV screen overhead playing a popular VHS cassette. Suncoast did not last much longer beyond the DVD revolution. I don't think I've been inside one in almost 20 years, but in the 1990s, Suncoast Video was the place to go. When I discovered through Records Doctor Who that there were commercially available cassettes containing lost Doctor Who stories, my college roommate and I in Baltimore went down to the Gallery Mall on Pratt Street. That is, or was, haven't been there in a long time, directly across the street from Harbor Place at the Inner Harbor. Went up to what was probably the top floor of the building, I think the 4th floor. Went into Suncoast Video, walked over to the sci-fi aisle, and there were 4 Doctor Who VHS cassettes, all with episodes that I did not even know still existed. I believe on that day I would have bought the Hartnell years and the Troughton years, and I think Cybermen or Daleks, the early years, I don't remember which. and Tomb of the Cybermen. There I was, a broke college student, putting on my credit card 4 times $20 VHS cassettes. My roommate Kenny thought I was nuts. Probably still does. I later got my revenge as Kenny's daughter became a huge Doctor Who fan when she was in her teens during the David Tennant and Matt Smith eras, so I think he finally understands what my obsession was about. So we took the bus back to our dorm, and there I was with a bag with 4 Doctor Who cassettes. Now, back in these days, most of us did not have individual TVs or VCRs in our dorm rooms. This was 1993, that's almost 30 years ago, and we had one common TV in the lounge with a VCR hooked up. And this would have been a Saturday afternoon, not too many folks in the lounge, nobody on the TV. So the first thing I did was unwrap Tomb of the Cybermen and plug in a 26-year-old black and white Doctor Who episode. And I spent the next 90 minutes watching, and much to my embarrassment, the lounge quickly filled up with just about every other person in the dorm, all sitting on the various couches, watching and cheering along in all the wrong places. They were laughing at all of the now dated special effects, such as the empty Cyberman suit and all that foam, and some of the less successful miniature effects. Well, successful in 1967, but definitely not successful on a what was probably a 25-inch color TV screen in a college dorm in Baltimore in early 1993. It was an interesting experience. Everybody laughed and applauded when the cassette was over. Again, not in the sense that they thought they were watching the greatest program of all time, but they were watching it, my dorm mates, for the kitsch value, and they certainly got their kicks out of it. Not the reaction that a Doctor Who fan is looking for, but that is what happened. I enjoyed the experience. It was the first time that I'd watched Doctor Who as part of a large group, even if unintentionally. And it took me a long time after that to acknowledge that Tomb of the Cybermen is, for its era, just an amazing bit of Doctor Who. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. We'll talk about the reactions that fandom, especially the older guard of fandom, those who grew up in the 1960s and remember having seen this story when it went out. We'll talk about how they came to react to the rediscovery of this program in 1992 and its release on VHS. And of course, this being a literature podcast, we are going to talk about the novelization in spades. But first, I have a guest interview this week. Very excited for him to be joining us, and we're going to talk about Tomb of the Cybermen, the book, and the TV story at length. Let's get to it. Joining me this week from the other side of the world is Stephen B. from the New to Who podcast. Stephen, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Jason. It is an absolute joy and privilege to be on the show talking one of my favorite stories, but also after listening to you for a number of months now, including a first binge of a number of episodes. So absolutely delighted to be on one of my favorite podcasts. Thank you.
You emailed me at a time before I was reading out listener emails on a weekly basis, and this is before I created my own email account, but you emailed me saying that you've been listening to the first 24 episodes one after another, and my immediate reaction was to apologize to you for having to hear my voice for what amounts to 30 straight hours of headphone time, so I'm really sorry that you had to do that.
Not at all. Thank you for the amazing content on a weekly basis as well. It's the perfect way to sort of start my Monday. I'll often go for a long walk in Singapore as the dawn rises, and it's just a lovely way to start the week.
See, in New York, most podcast listening is done on the subway, but if you've ever been on a New York City subway train, the background noise is so loud that unless you have a professionally produced podcast with a sound editor who knows what he's doing, and I'm afraid I do not fall under that category, most podcasts are almost impossible to hear. Or you crank the volume all the way up to hear somebody on the train, and then it cuts to commercial, and the commercial is 10 times louder than the show audio, and all of a sudden you've lost
Yeah.
50% of your hearing.
Yeah.
So I do most of my listening while walking or while washing dishes, but there's a lot of
Mhm.
podcasts that I listen to where I don't hear everything that's being said.
Yeah, no, you do a great service to us Doctor Who nerds, so thank you very much. I definitely appreciate it.
And you are, of course, like I said, on the other side of the planet. I was
Yeah.
in the Pacific Ocean for 10 days over the last 2 weeks. This is the
Oh,
first episode
wonderful.
that I'm recording after I've flown back. But you are even further out than that from the middle of the Pacific where I was. So I have now recorded, I think, you are the sixth different country that I've recorded with somebody from. Starting off
Amazing.
with my very first guest was an Australian living in Canada, and I've had a few people from the States, and then I've had England and Australia. And where is your home base when you're at home?
Well, Singapore these days. I've been there for about 5 years, and yeah, it's a great little city, and I'm enjoying it very much there. But it does get a little bit lonely sometimes, particularly away from Dan and Cole, my New Who co-hosts and long-term Doctor Who friends. So yeah, it's great to be able to join in conversations like this one about Doctor Who in a global community. It's been wonderful meeting people like yourselves and Joe Ford most recently when I went to the UK. So yeah, Singapore is now where I'm located, but yeah, it's nice to be in touch with everyone.
And looking at my listener numbers from the Anchor dashboard, I think you're probably my only listener in Singapore. So if you want to encourage a Singapore-based listening party, more Singapore-based Doctor Who fans, you are more than welcome.
Well, I haven't met one yet, but if I do, I'll definitely let them know.
Yeah, and obviously we met as part of the expanded Joe Ford podcast
Yes.
universe. So you've had several appearances on Hamster with a Blunt Penknife. Which stories have you covered with Joe?
Oh gosh, quite a number at this point. So we did Castrovalva, and we compared that against the Target novelization. That was a joy. It's actually my favorite Target novelization of all time. So that was immensely fun. We've also done the Invasion as well.
Right, I remember that.
Yeah, that's one of my absolute favorites. And again, Pat Troughton and Cybermen. It's just so iconic. I'm sure we've done others as well. We've done a couple of New Who's, certainly, Tooth and Claw in recent times. And when I was in the UK, actually, with Nathan Bottomley, we did The Haunting of the Diodati too.
It's funny how you mentioned Castrovalva. My favorite book is by the same author, Logopolis.
Yeah.
Castrovalva is the side of that. Christopher Bidmead recorded the audiobook novelization for Logopolis. Castrovalva, the duties went to Peter Davison. While I like Logopolis better, they're both phenomenal books, and I've already got my guests lined up for those two episodes, even though they're nearly a year away, even on a weekly
Wow, that's great.
So I'm very, very much looking forward to talking about those two books when the time comes. And the Invasion, again, that was book 98 or 99, so that means it is more than a year away on this podcast because I'm only on the 41st book, and I'm still only weekly. But I have a really interesting origin story for how I acquired the Invasion novelization, and I look forward to talking about that when the time comes. But that quickly became one of my favorite books ever, even though the splatter and bad word content is pretty extreme for a Target book.
It's so good, and it's probably because Ian Marder's sort of proclivity towards violence and gore that I enjoyed it so much when I was maybe 11 when I first read it. I think it's great. It's one of the great Target novelizations.
I had just turned 12 when I acquired that book, and again, the bad language and the splatter content was appealing to me at age 12 rather than appalling.
Exactly.
I'll even go so far as to say that when they released the Invasion on VHS, this is probably 1995, I was actually disappointed the very first time that I watched the Invasion. Probably the only person in fandom who was disappointed by that story because it wasn't as good as the novelization had led me to believe. It was missing a
Mhm.
couple of things that Ian Marter had put into the book.
Yeah.
And at that point, I was too young and immature in my fandom to realize what an incredible job of directing that Douglas Camfield had done. When I came around on the story again on DVD, and then for my pilgrimage, I must have hit the invasion about a little over a year ago, I guess early 2021, I'll say.
Mhm.
It was mind-blowingly good to me, especially when you figure out that I think episode 4 of The Invasion aired on the 5th anniversary of the show, November
It did.
23rd, 1968,
Yeah.
and it goes from being a show with a cast of 4 people inside of a shoebox just talking to this big budget action episode with lots of unit soldiers and an actual helicopter that they hired out. And the show evolved so much in those 5 years that when you watch it straight through in pilgrimage form, by the time you get to Invasion, you're blown away by how
Mm.
much this show has grown up. So again, when I get to the Invasion, that will be another very, very exciting episode to both watch and discuss.
Wonderful. Yeah. Yes.
And tell us a little bit about New to Who podcast. I've only been heavily involved in the podcast community probably for about 2 years since I started doing guest hosting duties on Trap One. Before that, there were only 2 podcasts that I appeared on very occasionally, and I just didn't have a lot of time or space to listen to all of them. Yours was one of the first ones that was
Oh,
suggested to me when I got more heavily into recording and listening. So I know that there hasn't been a new episode in a while, but tell us a little bit about New to Who and what you guys do on the show there.
well, firstly, thanks very much. That's very kind of you to say. But New to Who's sort of born of Tuesday night Doctor Who sessions at my old place back in Perth with Dan and Cole. And the idea of introducing these old, ancient, dusty, rather shaky-looking BBC productions from the 20th century to people who aren't familiar with it. So they could be new Who fans, or they could be people who have never seen Doctor Who before in their lives. So it's almost like an intro cast to not necessarily the best of Doctor Who, though there's a number of great stories that we've picked, but more so great starting off points or jumping on points. And that was the idea. And we've got through to about 30 odd episodes or 30 odd stories at this point. We're on a bit of a hiatus only because life gets in the way and COVID has happened and we're in different continents and all the rest of it. But we will return. And I'm really looking forward actually to seeing Dan and Cole in person again for the first time in over 3 years, hopefully in the not too distant future. And then at the same time, hopefully recording a next episode. That would be a wonderful way to do it.
Do you have a topic picked for your next episode, or have you left it hanging because it's been so long since you recorded the last one?
Yeah, I think we've got a short list definitely, but which one we do in the end is open to see. Well, not necessarily debate, but we'll have a think about what we want to do next. But we're getting to a point, I guess, where there's not all that many stories left for us to pick as great jumping off points or starting off points. So maybe the format of the show might change if it continues in that way.
And let's see. Have you been? So you have not been going in strict chronological order. You are going in order of, I guess, the classics, the all-time greats.
Yeah, to a degree. I mean, we're sort of jumping all over the place to sort of look at different eras. So we started off with actually with An Unearthly Child, that first 25 minutes, which I think is 10 out of 10, just immaculate television, stands up to this day. And it really is a great way to introduce, I think, people who haven't seen classic Who to Doctor Who in general. But we went through a Tom, we went through a Pertwee to a Troughton and all of that kind of thing. So we try to have a good coverage, I guess, and what the best starting points would be for each of those Doctors, and also each of those eras, because we look at Tom Baker and there's 3 separate and very distinct eras within that one Doctor's reign. So where would you go and how would you start tackling each of those eras, I guess, is the idea.
And let's talk then about Unearthly Child, because as far as pilots go, that is probably, of all the shows that I like, that is the one that has the best pilot, the most perfect pilot of all time. I think in modern TV, maybe Breaking Bad comes close in terms of perfection as a pilot episode, but you have to give Unearthly Child extra credit for being shot in real time in a small studio space almost 60 years ago, and it doesn't have the benefit of a large production budget or location shooting like the Breaking Bad pilot had. But this is almost a stress test question, and this is how I judge who is a real fan versus who is a hater. What do you
Okay.
think of the 3 episodes that come immediately after part 1 of Unearthly Child? What do you think of the 3 caveman episodes?
Well, I think the first thing that I need to say is that I think it's a distinct story. It's not the same story as the one that we see in part one. I think it serves a great purpose in terms of giving you an understanding of the characters, the dynamics between them, and sets up perhaps some of the tension that will sort of be resolved over the next few stories, particularly as we sort of head towards the end of Inside the Spaceship, Edge Destruction, whatever you want to call it. And so, in that regard, I think it serves a purpose. But I wouldn't say it's as good as the first episode just on a personal basis. But I absolutely can see just how much heavy lifting it does, and how clever as well the script is. You know, we basically have got an allegory for the Cold War in set in caveman times, and you know the potential for nuclear Armageddon through the metaphor of fire. So I think all of that's very rich, and all of that is very clever. It just doesn't strike me, perhaps, as the first episode does.
Right, and it's a little bit of a harder sell for a brand new fan because superficially
True.
it's actors wearing smudge makeup, running around in animal skins. But I think see, the caveman story never winds up on a list of the best historicals. And there was a historical almost every other month for the first 4 years of the show history.
True.
But you have to assume this one is really an underrated and almost criminally neglected historical because not only do you have this is the very first time that Doctor Who gets political, and people love to complain in the Jodie era, oh, the show's gone political because it has non-white people in important roles, and that's terrible. You can't do that. What's amazing is that in the very first actual story after the pilot, here's Doctor Who picking sides in a battle between
Exactly.
Neanderthal man and Homo sapiens, and the show's getting political right from the get-go. And Terrence Dicks leans into that in the novelization, talking expressly about politicians, even 100,000 years ago. And as you say, you have the overlay of the discovery of fire versus the Cold War that was then ongoing, and the people who didn't want there to be fire at all and wanted to stay in the Dark Ages, so to speak. And then, of course, you have Waris Hussein as director, who does a phenomenal job putting this all together under nearly impossibly penny-pinching circumstances. So, again, it's not a story that you would show, I think, to a first-time fan, but I think there needs to be a little bit more love for that 3-part caveman serial.
No, I accept that absolutely. And yeah, there's just so much going on with it in terms of everything I've said, the characters, the potential that it sets up for the show. It is really clever, I think. You're right.
Now, in terms of your own discovery to the show way back when, how did you first become a fan?
Well, I think there's always a difference between watching it for the first time or seeing it for the first time and then eventually becoming a fan. So in terms of first memories, I'm certain my first memory would be at some point in the late 80s, crouched behind our grey sofa as Betan and the Fourth Doctor are crouched in the trenches, and the Dalek sort of glides by underneath that purple and red sky. And that's an image that has stuck with me all this time. I found it truly terrifying. But it wasn't until a little bit later on, I guess, into primary school, when my brother and a friend discovered 28 first edition Target novelizations bound in that sort of library plastic that they always do.
Yes.
In a corner of the library that didn't seem to have been touched when you look at the borrowing records, that sort of old analog with the stamp borrowing system that you used to have in primary school since the early 80s. And so it was like, discovering this kind of treasure. And I got hooked. Terrence Dicks is the reason I got hooked to Doctor Who, but Terrence Dicks is also the reason why, I later went on to do, postgrad in literary theory and cultural studies. It was an enormously important turning point in my life. I mean, I later went on to become a literature teacher. I later went on to do masters and all the rest of it. So that moment is so important for me, and it really is those 28 Target novelizations, most of which were Terrence Dicks in this old primary school library that unlocked, well, the trajectory of my life, I guess.
Do you recall, of those 28 books, which was your first one, or which was your first ones? Which is the one that said, wow, I really, really need to read all of these?
Oh, I mean, it was the first two that my brother, because you're only allowed to borrow two at that point, the first two that my brother borrowed out from the library that I sort of picked up when he brought them home was Plunder of the Daleks and Death to the Daleks. They've got those wonderful covers, and we might talk about the covers later on. And I think
yes.
Those two still in my mind stick out as top 10, even if not necessarily their wonderful television shows. But the Terrence Dick's treatment, I think, really spoke to the 9-year-old version of me, just in terms of an adventure story, in terms of the character of the Doctor, who I hadn't seen before in this incarnation. I knew Sarah Jane Smith, obviously from having seen Doctor Who, but not being a fan, a few years earlier. But the holy grail of those 28 was actually a book that was mislaid in another part of the library, maybe even hidden by a previous fan from years ago, and it was Genesis. And the day I recall we found that hidden amongst a totally separate section of the library, it was akin to the light sort of shining through the window, the chorus starting around us. That was the holy grail for us. And of course, I remember Genesis from having seen those iconic images perhaps 2 or 3 years earlier on our ABC, and being so terrified by it. And to this day, I probably still feel that Genesis is maybe the very best classic Doctor Who story we've ever had. Now, that's open to debate, and it changes on a day-to-day basis, but it is such a totemic story, and that novelization, again by Terrence Dicks, just a masterpiece.
There have been a couple of fans on Twitter over the last month or two who have gone through and rated the entire either classic series or the entire series, including the present. So somebody went through and rated the entire classic series from number 160 all the way to number 1. And then one of my other followers that I also follow back is also in the process right now and has been ranking down from 300, I think. So I have never done that myself. And when I did my pilgrimage, I started that in October 2020 with Unearthly Child and Cave of Skulls. And I am now, having had hiatus to go on vacation, I am in the middle of the 3-part Star Monks trilogy from the final Peter Capaldi season. That means I'll be done in about 6 weeks. When the centenary airs, I'll finish my entire pilgrimage. I don't have, I think, the ability to rank all those stories 1 through 300. I might need to watch again and do specific numerical ratings so that I can rank. But I was doing an informal top 10 as I was watching the series through in pilgrimage format. And then when I got to Inferno, I realized this is the best episode of the first 7 years. And then I got to the Demons. This is right up there. When I got to Green Death, this is the best episode of the first 10 years. The Genesis of the Daleks is one of the ones. And Genesis, I think, has a slow start. And other fans have sort of soured on it over the years as not being as good as its reputation. But when you get to the end, especially once Davros becomes a character proper in Part 3, and once you get to all those great crackling dialogue bits between Michael Wisher and Tom Baker, I think Genesis easily belongs in the top 10, if not the top 5 of the classic series. And for you to have it as your first memory of the show, and almost, who is a better director than David Maloney? I mean, he just knocked it out of the park with that. So, whereas my very first exposure to the show was Time Flight, and my first full episode was Arc of Infinity. So, you had a much more smooth sailing introduction than I did, for sure.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it?
And the book that we're talking about this week, there's certainly a lot to discuss between the TV episode and the novelization and the cover. So we're talking about, of course, Tomb of the Cybermen. You and I, probably being of similar age and having become fans in the 1980s, you and I were probably both aware that this was reported to be one of the greatest stories of all time in the Jeremy Bentham chapter of A Celebration, where he's talking about each story, seasons 1 through 19, or maybe even seasons 1 through 20. he has a very high praise for Tomb of the Cybermen. So if you're a young impressionable fan reading Doctor Who: A Celebration in the mid '80s, Tomb of the Cybermen becomes one of your favorite stories, even though it was impossible to watch at that point. And then you have the book. I'll be breaking down the book in the other half of this program, and I have a lot of superlative things to say about it, and some criticisms too,
Mm.
some cultural elements that it aged very poorly. But when I was reading this in the mid '80s, secure in my Jeremy Bentham provided opinion, this was the greatest story of all time. I was over the moon on Records Doctor Who when I learned that this story had been recovered in 1992, and I'll talk
Oh.
some more later about my first experience in watching this on the common TV in my college dorm in 1993 with a bunch of non-Doctor Who fans who happened to be in the room, who were riveted by this clunky old broadcast and some of the very, very, even for 1993, even more so now, 30 years later, dated special effects. There was a undercurrent of emotion in fandom after the story was recovered and released that it wasn't nearly as good as everyone had been saying that it was, and that Jeremy Bentham had been working through a filter or a prism of a cheating memory. And
Mm.
if you're listening to this show in real time, I've already read out some sample reviews that were written in the early 1990s talking about their disappointment in this episode as it actually was versus how it was reported to be. When did you first see Tomb of the Cybermen as a live video? When did you read the book? Which one did you encounter first? And did you have any of that disappointment that the episode wasn't as good as everyone said it was supposed to have been?
Well, it's a really good question because primarily Doctor Who is a written text for me. Having come through it through the targets, this is very much my first experience of Tomb of the Cybermen and many other stories. And that childhood imagination when you're 9 years old and you're able to conjure those images for yourself based on the prose, nothing's ever going to match up to that. But I wasn't part of fandom until I would say probably less than 10 years ago to sort of fully understand its reception. So I had no real inclination that it wasn't seen as a classic or whatever the case may be until I really sort of started to seek out through Twitter largely other fans' opinions and what received wisdom was. But by that point, it was too late. I'd already made my mind up, and as a primary school aged kid coming to these stories, you're not going to have anything but love for them. They're like Tintin comics. They can't possibly decay in your mind in terms of how wonderful and enjoyable they are. And it probably wouldn't have been until the late 90s that I actually finally got to saw Tomb of the Cybermen. And by that stage, I'd seen a lot of other 60s genre television, and it was on par with The Avengers or The Prisoner or whatever the case may be. Okay, sure, it looked like it was not as big a budget perhaps that was devoted towards its production, but the production values very much felt like British television and cult British television from the 60s. So it didn't suffer for my exposure to it in terms of the 4 episodes that were eventually found in a Mormon church basement in Hong Kong in 1992. In fact,
Yes.
it was just like another layer, perhaps, in terms of the reading of the text, which, again, the primary one still remains to this day the target novelization. That's how I conceive of it. That's how I imagine it. That's very much the images that are in my mind of the tombs and the bas reliefs and the antechamber and all of that sort of stuff that's in the Jerry Davis novelization. Okay, we don't see that on television, but that's fine because that is just another almost interpretation of the story. And I know that's back to front, but that's very much my history in terms of coming to Doctor Who through the targets.
See, I was discovering the TV show contemporaneous to the books. I started watching in late
Wonderful.
'84, and I got my first books in early '85.
Mm.
So I was lucky enough, and I've said this before on many, many other episodes, but I'll just repeat briefly. As someone who had access to Doctor Who from up to 6 different PBS stations that were all available on my New York City cable carrier,
Wow.
versus this working for my books as a babysitter to my kid sister, getting 2 books every 2 weeks, which means that within a couple of years I had almost the entire collection up till that point. And then once I got a job in the late '80s, I was able to buy the books out of my own meager minimum wage salary. So I had all the books and almost all the surviving episodes available to me right away, and I was able to
Mm,
form very firm opinions as a preteen as to what I liked versus what I didn't like. And like you say, there were almost no bad books or episodes when you're that age because,
exactly.
as you say with Tintin, the joy of reading it really subsumes whether or not the story's any good. So there's great stories and there's super great stories, but when you're that age, there's really nothing bad. I know for
That's
me,
so true.
book, the book Tomb of the Cybermen was absolutely one of my stone cold favorites. And what
Mm,
Jerry Davis does in painting a word picture, again, the way that the 3-part Caveman serial never gets listed as one of the best black and white historicals, even though it arguably should be. When I see people on Twitter or Facebook talking about who are the greatest target novelization writers, everybody says Terrence, everybody says Malcolm Hall, everybody says Ian Marter, everybody says Ben Aronovich. You never really hear of Jerry Davis discussed as one of the great novelization writers, which I think, if that's the case, is very unfair because the books that he did, with the possible exception of Celestial Toymaker, which I don't think he wrote one word of,
mm.
every book where he is the sole credited author is incredible. Even The Highlanders, which is kind of a throwaway TV story for reasons we'll discuss later on, next year probably. The Highlanders is an incredible book because of Jerry Davis's writing style. He's writing these books as movie treatments, and he gives you detailed, vivid, brief character descriptions, and his word picture and his way of describing geography and sets. A much more vivid writer visually than even Terrence Dicks, who's one of the greatest of all time. So I am a huge fan of Jerry Davis's writing, and that is a hill that I will die on, and I wish his name turned up more often on lists of the greatest novelization writers.
Yeah, I
As
absolutely
a
agree.
So, from your perspective, talk about the writing style in this book. What about the writing style in the novelization speaks to you and keeps coming back to you, more than 30 years after you first read it?
Do you know what? If I was trying to think about this earlier, and how would I sum it up? There's almost like a beautiful austerity to Davis's prose. It's very adroit, but also very readable, and perhaps an ever so slightly maybe higher reading age fashion than Terence's own prose. But it's nonetheless wonderfully evocative of that story. And maybe even foreboding. Like there's a wonderful connection, I guess, between what the Cybermen represent and how terrifying they are to a childhood imagination, and Davis's prose, I feel. And occasionally you get interspersed with that these moments of these beautiful moments of charm that sort of elucidate on the characters. So you can have these sort of immensely imposing descriptions of the tombs and the cyber controller and the reviving chambers and all of that kind of stuff, which is just epic and gorgeously told, whilst at the same time terrifying. And then he throws in different things like 2 or 3 times as mentions of the Doctor's green eyes, or his sadness and his smile. There's a moment where Victoria's girl crush on Kaftan is sort of explored, and it's just like it's just really lovely ways of bringing the character moments as well as the sort of epic nature of the story together. I've got a little quote here from chapter 10. I think it's page 111, and it's about the Doctor's smile in that sort of colloquy between the Doctor and Victoria, and reads, "He smiled at her with his rare kind smile, a smile so kind that it seemed to take all the sadness there was inside it and still come out as a smile." That's
Oh, wow.
wonderful. That is so poetic and beautiful, but at the same time, they're the sort of moments of grace that sort of are bolted onto. Bolted on sounds a bit artificial. That sort of emerge from that sort of very adroit, readable prose that Davis has as well, I think.
That's a really good point, and that is a quote that I've already incorporated into my script for the other half of the
Fantastic.
program. So it's funny that you and I are zeroing in on the same turns of phrase.
Yeah.
Once Doom was recovered and once it was released on video, some of the casting choices in terms of ethnicity have remained
Mm.
controversial. Talking most specifically about Shirley Cooklin playing a Middle Eastern character and Roy Stewart playing Toberman. If there are any criticisms to be made of this book, I think it would have to be with its racial and gender politics. And I'll dive into that in a lot more detail in the second hour. But this is a book of its time. It's written in 1978 when folks weren't really reading book. Most folks were not reading books from a gender or race critical point of view. How do you think Jerry Davis handles issues such as Toberman and Victoria and Captain?
Yeah, look, I think you're right to sort of say that it needs to be taken in terms of its production, but equally important is the reader's context as well, and we can sort of talk about that later on. But if we have a look at those characters, they are somewhat reductive. You know, Tobin is an archetypal noble savage. That's very much what he's portrayed as. He's called a Turk, which, as a sub-Saharan African, isn't quite right. And the only thing that I can think of, just thinking about the Turkish old Turkish Empire of the Ottoman Empire, it did extend quite a distance into the Middle East, where we have sub-Saharan Africans in places like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. So perhaps that's what he's confusing it with. I'm not sure, but like the fact that you call a sub-Saharan African or a man of sub-Saharan African extract, in terms of Roy Stewart, who came from the Caribbean, I believe, as a Turk, is clearly just wrong. It's like his basic geography is fundamentally flawed. There's that othering that he does, and it takes the form of a number of things. And in terms of Kaftan, she's given that sort of allure of the East and of the other. She's exotic and beautiful, and then has a hypnotic voice and all of that kind of thing. And you just sort of think, this is really it wouldn't be something that would pass these days. But as you say, this is written in 1978 for a children's audience by an author who hasn't gone through necessarily a post-structuralist or postmodern school of writing and mode of production, and it isn't something that was conscious of at that time. Now, the other half of that equation, I think, is the reader reception. Maybe we'll sort of get onto that in due time. But there are those moments of clang where it's clear that this is written by an author from another time for an audience of another time, and it does stand out these days. Absolutely.
You raise a really interesting point with the use of the word Turk, and I will say that word confused me tremendously between 1985, when I would have read the book, and 1993, when I purchased the surviving VHS tapes.
Right.
For me, the word Turk conjured up a bald, swarthy white man with a handlebar mustache wearing a black wrestler's singlet. That was the image that popped into my head in 1985 when I saw the word Turk. So if I were to be asked and handed some drawing materials to draw Toberman in the mid-1980s, that's what I would have drawn. It never once occurred to me that this was a black character who was being portrayed as an ignorant /savage /slave or servant.
Yeah.
So watching Roy Stewart's performance on television was a shock to me, because it wasn't what I was expecting from the use of the word Turk. I see now that Jerry Davis uses the word dark once to describe Toberman, which is
notice that, yeah.
a word that I wish people would stop using to describe. For example, I'll confess to you, just between you and me, I have terrible reading habits. And even though I was an English major for a semester and a half, and even though I have read most of the great works of literature along the way, because my day job is so intense, when I am reading for pleasure, I like to read junk. And I have developed some bad habits. I read a lot of John Grisham, the American courtroom writer. And I've developed this really bad habit of reading a lot of Steve Berry, who is another one of these Dan Brown type writers who writes historical mysteries where the main character is a spy and solves all these previously unknown historical mysteries by discovering historical documents that no one has seen for thousands and thousands of years. So I'm reading one of his books on the airplane flight back from the Pacific Ocean last night, and he introduces a character, doesn't say where the character is from or what the accent is, but describes the character as nodding his, quote, black head, unquote, up and down. And what is this supposed to mean? Is he describing the hair or the skin color? And granted, you're from the South in the U.S., which has its own connotations, but what does it mean if you're in the year 2020 using the word black head to describe a character who's just been introduced? Where is this language coming from? What editor thought this was a good idea to put in? And
Baffling.
there has to be a better way to describe your character's ethnicity than a phrase like that. And Jerry Davis is writing this book more than 40 years before Steve Berry wrote his. And maybe we weren't in tune to these kind of things in 1978, but uh, again, if you were to start from scratch and rewrite the book for a 2022 audience, you could probably take 95% of Jerry Davis's writing and port it in as is. That's how good it is. But that little bit of the book still, shocks me because the language is so clumsy from a 2022 perspective.
Yeah, that is true. And I think you're right about the 95%. I think the other thing that sort of works against the characters, particularly those marked as villains in terms of Kaftan, Klieg, and Toberman, is that they are so othered. So we have a largely white cast, whether it's in Viner or Parry or Hopper and the rest of them. And of course, the TARDIS team themselves are Anglo as well. And then we have these three characters who, I mean, if I were to sort of infer from the descriptions, Toberman is a Turk, but we know obviously played by a black actor on television. Kaftan, I think she's definitely referred to as Middle Eastern. I'm not sure if at some point Egypt is referred to as her sort of nationality.
He uses the word Arab or Arabian several times.
That's right, yeah.
And then he uses the word inscrutable twice, which is a word now that is as offensive a word as you can give to someone from a different ethnic group than your own.
Absolutely.
But he uses it twice, probably intending it as praise, but the word does appear. And again, if you were to rewrite the book now in 2022, that word would be allowed nowhere near the second draft.
Yeah, you're quite right. But there's also Klieg as well, and the Klieg sort of representation, I think, is a little bit more subtle, but still nonetheless quite insidious as a result. He comes from a brotherhood, so there's sort of elements of an international or intergalactic conspiracy here. His name is vaguely Germanic, and he has these delusions of grandeur around in terms of him becoming a great ruler. And it's almost as though, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but my sort of reading of that is that it's almost as though it's a take on those early 20th century stereotypes of Jewish people, particularly German Jewish people, that the Nazis played against. And I wonder how unconscious that is, and certainly I don't think it's intended, but then nonetheless the tones and the evocations, I think, that sort of come across from a character like that, similar in some regards to the Fu Manchu overlays, although they're perhaps a bit more apparent on the Weng Chiang sort of character that we get as well. And it just makes it a little bit uncomfortable, I think. It doesn't mean that you can't like Tomb. I think what you can say is you have a story that you've grown to love by virtue of the fact that it's been there since you were a very young boy, but that the representations within those stories of those characters and the othering of the villains in those very clear and maybe even insidious ways is not something that we can accept anymore, and that is, it makes for a flawed text, but it doesn't make for a text that is suddenly worthless or not something to be enjoyed. You can enjoy something and know that it is fatally flawed as well.
As a Jewish kid growing up in the New York City suburbs when I did, I was very much looking out for references to Jewish people in Doctor Who, which are very few and far between, not only in the classic series, but also in the new. But I never, until this recording today, I never considered that Klieg was coded as a Jewish character. Obviously, I was very sensitive to the Julius Silverstein business in Web of Fear, and I was grateful to Parent Fix for eliminating that. And as we discussed with our Talons episode last month, you have this character with the name Mrs. Samuelson, who is described as a bloodsucker. And Terrence Dicks completely erased every bit of that character from the novelization of Talons. I was thinking Klieg more in line of your... And again, this was a story that was written in the 1960s, and they cast an actor who was using an Austrian accent with a very close resemblance to the way that Arnold Schwarzenegger speaks English today. I was thinking that Klieg was coded more of as a neo-Nazi surviving Nazi character. But what I will say later on in this broadcast is that you do have two Jewish actors in the production, both playing unfortunate stereotypes. You have the actor who plays Viner and the actor who plays Kaftan, both of Jewish descent. And Doctor Who was doing a lot of that in the 60s. If you look at the actors who were cast as villains or foreigners, from Marco Polo all the way to Abominable Snowmen, if there is a swarthy bad guy, it's probably an actor of Jewish descent playing him. And that's an interesting thing to discuss in a show that was first produced and almost co-created in a sense by Verity Lambert. It's an interesting journey for the show to take, and that's a much larger topic than I can get into over the course of this podcast, but it's something that I am always keeping an eye out for, and I'll be discussing it a little bit later in the recording. This is the first time that I've heard Klieg described in those terms, and that is definitely food for thought, so thank you for bringing that to my attention. I'm going to have to consider that a little further.
Oh no! Look, I'm not saying it's right or not. It's just my own interpretation. But George Pastel is a Cypriot actor, I believe, so he speaks in that sort of Eastern Mediterranean accent, and maybe that's sort of the connotation, or that was a sort of clue that made me think, oh, perhaps this is meant to be a Jewish stereotype, particularly with the Brotherhood of Magicians, which seems to sort of harken back to those international conspiracy nonsense ideas that the German people had, the Nazis had of the Jewish people. So I may be entirely off beam, but that's certainly what I was picking up, I guess.
So we have, for a story that we both very much enjoy, and for a book that we both very much enjoy, we have been spending a lot of time being critical of a small percentage of the book and the way that characters of ethnicity were described in the 1960s and 70s. Let's abruptly switch gears to a happier topic. Let's talk about the cover of this book by the artist Jeff Cummings.
Isn't it wonderful?
It is. The only thing that it does wrong is it uses the wrong Cyberman head. I've talked about this before. This particular Cyberman helmet is my Cyberman helmet, because my first full Cyberman story, Revenge of the Cybermen, this is what the Cybermen were wearing. It was a major disappointment for me to watch the story on video in 1993 and realize that the Cyberman on the book is not the model that we get on television.
I have to admit, I'm with you on this one, and maybe because I have unremembered sort of imprints of the Revenge of the Cybermen on ABC at some point in the late 80s before I became a fan. They were certainly on the cover of Revenge of the Cybermen and Invasion as well. So they were my Cybermen. So I just assumed, like yourself, that they would be the Cybermen that we see in Tomb as well. So I was quite surprised when I saw it too. I love these Cybermen. I think that they are the classic sort of design of them from the classic series. And in particular, that painting that we've got by Jeff Cummings on the cover is, I think, the almost portrait, if you like, for Cybermen in the classic years of Doctor Who. It's, the sort of three-quarter profile, that sort of impassive look. I love the red that's used on the eyes and the teardrops, and that sort of helmet laser. I'm not really sure what that if that's used at all at any point, but it just really does evoke for me exactly what the archetypal Cyberman is. I think it's one of the top 10 Target novelization covers of all time for me.
And it's not just the painting of the cyber helmet itself. You have the ice, the projections of ice, or rocky ice behind the Cybermen, which is far beyond what we got in Lime Grove D when the TV series was produced. You don't get ice like that or rocks like that.
Exactly.
You have the three gold beams of light on the lower right-hand corner of the page, and then the Cyberman's red helmet lamp is casting a red glow on the ice and the rocks behind him. And then this shade of blue that is used for the endorphin rush that I get from looking at this shade of blue, even without looking at the painting below, there's a lot to recommend about. And on a totally frivolous note, the combination of orange and blue is the official colors of. It's the official colors of New York State, and most New York-based sports teams have the orange and blue as their color scheme. So for me, any orange and blue combination is an automatic winner, just by virtue of where I grew up and what teams I rooted for.
I knew you were going to say it. Yeah, definitely. The blue and the orange just work for me as well. I just have distinct memories of the sort of contrast of those two colours, and it's sort of popping from the shelves. So, absolutely, the choice even down to the orange is great. But on the use of the wrong Cyberman that you mentioned before, I don't know if you've seen, but perhaps in the last 10 years or so, Alistair Pearson redid the cover of Tomb using the era appropriate, story appropriate Cybermen, and that's actually the one that we used with kind permission of Alistair Pearson on the cover art when it came to the Tomb of the Cybermen episode for New to Who as well. Just because we wanted it
Wow.
to be that little bit more screen accurate, but yeah, I love that as fans, and Alistair Pearson is most certainly a fan. We would see that sort of correction in time. I think it's great.
Yeah, he has been very active on the Target Facebook group, and he posts a lot of his art in progress and the changes that he makes over the years. So it's fascinating to follow him and see what he's been doing behind the scenes.
Yeah.
So this is, of course, a Jeff Cummins piece of work. What do you have? If you say this is one of the top 10 Target covers, what other great covers would you recommend?
I mean, I did this as an exercise just in the last few days, and I had a initial short list. I'm using air quotes there, really a long list of 50 that I could have picked, and any of those 50 were worthy top 10s. But I tried to be as brutal as possible and try to think of, well, what's the most iconic, and try to sort of spread it across the Doctors as well. And there's a lot of Daleks in there. I mentioned Planet of the Daleks and Death to the Daleks. The initial Daleks cover novelization artwork by Chris Achilleos for
Yes.
An Exciting Adventure, and also Dalek Invasion, I think, is up there as well. In terms of Second Doctor, Tomb, I think is my absolute favourite, but the other one that still sends shivers down my spine every time I see it is The Web of Fear. I think that is an incredible piece of artwork, and again sort of evokes the atmosphere of the base under siege. And then Seeds of Doom, I guess, in terms of that initial run as well as the great Fourth Doctor one. And I could have included so many more there. There's The Hand of Fear, which is, I think, a bit of a neglected story, but that wonderful cover art of the Doctor and Sarah Jane against a quarry wall with the shadow of the hand above them is wonderful. But then perhaps sort of going on into the later runs, the Five Doctors, that silver cover is so iconic.
Oh, yes.
The Two Doctors is the 100th novelisation. They make a big deal of that. That looks beautiful too. The two TARDISes and the gold inlay. And in terms of the Seventh Doctor, I'd probably have to settle for Ghostlight, which I think has got wonderful paneling to sort of frame Gabriel Chase and the two leads as well. But like I say, there's 50 that I initially counted that I could have selected. And a lot of them sort of come from that initial era, the initial sort of 2 or 3 years where I think you have that sort of Target house style developed. And then the way that it sort of iterates over the years as well. Like I still have a soft spot for, I said Castrovalva earlier, but any of those Fifth Doctor ones, they're so plain and simple and really a bit underwhelming. But again, they were my entry into those stories. So I think of Mordred Undead and that utterly beige colour with the utterly beige photograph. I still love it. I can't help myself. I'm just so attached to the range.
The photographic covers were obviously a money-saving device, but I discovered them very early on in my book collection. And when you look at other novelizations or other book tie-ins, most of them are just doing stock covers where it's 3 or 4 heads and then a single background image, like a lot of the Star Trek books.
Right.
Most of the book lines aren't doing what Doctor Who is doing in commissioning full-fledged paintings. One of the drawbacks by becoming a fan in the 80s is that I was getting these second-generation covers. When JNT becomes producer and says no past Doctors on new covers, they took the Doctor off the Abominable Snowmen cover, they took the Doctor off the Crusaders cover, and then, of course, I had Pinnacle books. 7 of my books are Pinnacle, so we had bespoke art by the American artist David Mann and not the UK art at all. So my copy of Seeds of Doom, my copy of Mask of Mandragora do not have the UK covers. They have entirely new versions, up to and including the infamous Unit spaceship on the Pinnacle
Wonderful. Yeah. So, and I wonder whether if it wasn't for J&T's edict about not having past Doctors on the covers, whether we would have had those beautiful Chris Achilleos, reprinted for the Crusaders, as you say. I think they're wonderful. The Web of Fear or the Abominable Snowman. That in fact, the Abominable Snowman's another one that's brilliant, absolutely gorgeous cover illustration to that one. And yeah, that second imprint or the second cover rather isn't a patch on it.
I like the second cover because it is an evocative image. even if the Doctor is not on it. But you're right, when you go back and look at the original covers that were discarded, the remake, no matter how pleasing it is not as good as the original.
Is that how you feel, I wonder, about the Blue Spine reprints as well?
That's a conversation that I really have not gone into. There are people on the Facebook group who are Blue Spine collectors, and I
Mm-hmm.
understand 100%, because for many of these stories, it's the only way you're going to get a cover that has the period appropriate Doctor on it.
Mm.
So for like Tomb of the Cybermen, this is the original cover, and as gorgeous a cover as it is, you would never know that it's a Patrick Troughton story because
That's
it
true.
uses a Cyberman that was not common in the Troughton era, except for his final Cyberman story, and it doesn't have the Doctor or Victoria or Jamie. So people who collect for the covers tend to gravitate towards the blue spines because they give you the right Doctor for the right book. For my purpose, though, remember that I was getting my books as a babysitting fee, and I was getting almost all of my novelizations in 85, 86, 87.
Mm.
I completed my collection for the most part by 1991 when I bought Battlefield at a used bookstore in Baltimore as a college
Oh,
student
wow.
that December. At that point, there were only two books that I hadn't gotten. Power of Kroll and Horror of Fang Rock, which I got at conventions in the mid 90s. By the time the Blue Spine started coming out, I already had every book that was available in Blue Spine format with a different cover. So I
Mm-hmm.
wasn't going to buy it twice. The
Yeah.
only Blue Spine that I have is the Nightmare Fair, because I hadn't collected the lost storybooks. When I decided to finally buy the Nightmare Fair at a convention in Toronto in 1997, Who Party, that's when I bought the Nightmare Fair, and it was the Blue Spine. That's the only Blue Spine that I have.
Gosh,
So I
wow.
can't really speak to them because they came out at a unique era in fandom when I didn't need the books anymore because I already had nearly a complete collection. So to this day, I have a single Blue Spine. So I really can't say much about them. I don't collect them. I have a full set at this point. I'm not going to duplicate it. So
Mm.
they're nice. I appreciate them, but it's not a part of my circle of fandom.
Yeah, that's fair enough, I think. I mean, my when it came to sort of buying my own, I think the Blue Spine era is when I sort of had the wherewithal to start collecting. So I had a number of those Blue Spines, but really, I mean, I don't have a preference. I think it's really just about at that point adventuring from library to library or from bookstore to bookstore and seeing what you could find in faraway Australia. And sometimes they were in the bargain basement bins of a sort of a what was it, a Kmart or a Target or something like that. And they were great because they were $1 each, and they were the sort of mid '80s or the early '80s photo montage ones.
Right.
So I have a fondness for those ones. I adore the later Sylvester runs, the original ones that were done by Alistair Pearson. I think they're just absolutely superb pieces of art. And the Chris Achilles and the Jeff Cummins and all of those again just sort of transport me back to my initial sort of flush of fandom through the Target novelizations. And yeah, I mean, I have a soft spot for all of them. I think because they were all present all at the same time in that sort of early '90s era when I was really coming into fandom.
When I had Jim Sangster on a couple of weeks ago, he was talking
Mm.
about the Easter eggs that Alistair Pearson embeds in his covers. So I had never noticed independently, but thanks to Jim on this show, I now know that the cover illustration to Delta and the Bannerman is an inverted Mickey Mouse a Mickey Mouse head, because the story was supposed to
Yeah.
be set in Disneyland, and that the painting for Happiness Patrol is in the structure of an A because of Helen A. That's incredibly clever work, and I never would have
Yeah.
noticed that it was there. Perhaps it was too clever by half if most folks didn't notice. But once Jim told me that, it completely made me reevaluate. I knew these were great covers, but now they're even better than that because of the Easter eggs that are being put in.
Mm.
I mean, the Tomb of the Cybermen cover is wonderful, but there's no hidden message to be recovered from the Tomb of the Cybermen cover,
No, not really. I
unfortunately.
mean, it's just a beautiful, iconic snapshot, and you've got the sort of rounded arch of the tomb itself, the sort of cells from which the Cybermen emerge, the ice in the background, as you say, and just those red eyes and the red laser just do it for me as well.
So we've talked about your podcast. We've talked about Tomb of the Cybermen, both on television and the book. We've talked about some of the less savory aspects of the story. We've talked about the cover.
Sure.
Now it's time to play a game, and we are going to play a game of 20 questions. So I have picked a story at random. It is one story between 1963 and 2022. I know what the story is, you do not. Using 20 yes or no questions, you are going to guess which story it is. Are you ready to play?
Try. I surely can't be the first one to fail this, but yes, let's play it.
The record is 7 by Simon Hart.
Of course it
Nobody has failed. I think one person got to 18 questions, but nobody has failed, and I doubt you will be the first. So off we go.
Fingers crossed. Okay. Is it classic Who?
Yes, it is. Question number 2.
Is it a black and white Who?
Yes, it is. Question number 3.
Ooh, this is interesting. Is it a Troughton?
No, it is not a Troughton. Question number 4.
Okay. So it is a hard one. Is it... You spoke so beautifully about Season 2 last time. Season 2, is it a Season 2 story?
It is not a Season 2 story. That brings us to question 5.
Oh gosh. Is it a Season 1?
You are still in line to set the all-time record, by the way. What is question 5?
Is it Season 1?
Yes, it is. Question 6.
See, this is where I can go scattergun and hope to break the record, or whether I should continue to my methodical approach. So let's go scattergun. Is it the Sensorites?
Ooh, a story that I adore, but it is not the Sensorites. Now, question 7. You have a chance of tying the record because you have the era right, you have the Doctor right, you have the season right. It's 8 serials to that season. There are 7 left. If you get it right on the first try, you are guaranteed to not fail, but you have one shot at tying the all-time record for Doctor Who literature.
Oh gosh, okay. Well, I'm going to have a stab, aren't I? Kings of Marinus.
Oh, I'm sorry. It is not Kings of Marinus.
Okay, then. Is it... Well, let's just do this methodically. Is it an unearthly child?
Question 8 is... It is not an unearthly child, which brings us to question 9.
Is it the Daleks?
Yes, it is the Daleks. Question 9, you got it.
Okay.
What's wild is if you had gone in chronological order, you would have gotten it to 2. Of course, you have to narrow it down first. So...
I'm still happy with that, nonetheless. Okay, I was really lucky with those guesses then.
Yeah, you were. I mean, you got the era, and you got the Doctor in a hurry, and after that it was just narrowing down the season. If you had asked Season 1 before you asked Season 2, then you probably would have had it in record time.
It's possible. We'll never know. That was a lot of fun. Oh gosh, I feel the pressure off now.
I am now going to reload the randomizer for my next victim. My next guest. Oh, this is a very interesting choice. Whoever is my guest next week or next time is going to have a very fun time with 20 questions.
Oh.
So,
Lovely.
Where can we find you and your work product on the internet, Stephen?
Well, I mean, as I say, New to Who podcast, there's a backlog there of about 30-odd episodes, and they're one of those. It's one of those episodes and one of those podcasts, I guess, where you don't have to listen to them immediately. You can go back, even though years have passed, and dive into the back catalogue. And you can find us at www.newtowho.com. We're also on Twitter, but that seems to be a bit inactive. And of course, wherever you get your podcasts from. And in terms of myself, you can catch me at Steed Stylin, STEEDSTYLIN. Homage there to Patrick McNee's character in The Avengers. Actually, just one more thing I forgot to mention. We were talking earlier about rankings. If you go to the New to Who website, there is a link to an Excel spreadsheet that I put together about 5 years ago now that goes to the end of the Capaldi that will perhaps allow you and help you to sort of keep track of your scores and then graphically represent them on a bell curve as well. So that could be something to look out for if you're that way inclined.
So I am looking for that right now. The Doctor Who ratings matrix.
That's the one. Of course, I had to call it the Matrix.
Interesting. See, I have never done this. Again, I've watched every episode of the series from Unearthly Child through Extremis in the last 22 months. So I probably could go back, but I will say that for the new series, many of the new series stories I was only watching for the second time, and they sort of blurred together because of Stephen Moffat's plotting style. So I'm not positive that I would be able to rate a lot of the new series stories out of 100, because on any given minute it could be a 40 or an 80. That's how little memory I have of some of them. But maybe the classic series only, where my opinions are more set in stone and firm. So maybe I'll try this and share the results at a later date.
Well, it'd be lovely to see. Yeah, it'd be very interesting.
All right, Stephen, thank you so much for joining me for this hour. This has been a lot of fun. We've covered a lot of ground. We'll have to get you back on here again.
Oh, I'd love that. Thank you, Jason. It's been an enormous amount of fun. And I would love to come back at some point. One day. Yes, one day.
One day. We'll see you soon.
See you then. Be seeing you.
Doctor Who and the Tomb of the Cybermen, written by Jerry Davis. Televised as The Tomb of the Cybermen. Teleplay by Jerry Davis, from a story by Jerry Davis and Kit Pedler, with additional material by Victor Pemberton. Screen credit to Kit Pedler and Jerry Davis. Televised in September 1967, published in May 1978. The Cybermen, silver, indestructible monsters whose only goal is power, seem to have disappeared from their planet, Telos, when a party of archaeologists, joined by the Doctor, Jamie, and Victoria, land on the Cybermen's barren, deserted planet. They uncover what appears to be their tomb. But once inside, it becomes clear that the Cybermen are not dead, and some, in the group of archaeologists, desperately want to reactivate these monsters. How can the Doctor defeat these ruthless, power-seeking humans and the Cybermen? Here are a couple of snippets of reviews of the Tomb of the Cybermen VHS cassette, which was released in the UK in May 1992. The full reviews are easily available online. Some of the reviewers and fanzine editors are still active in fandom. I will, again, not be naming names, as the point is not to dissect someone's genuine opinion from 30 years ago. What I'm trying to do is reflect what a vocal corner of fandom said about this story, when it was recovered and re-released nearly 25 years after its original airing. Here's one. Quote, "Ever get the feeling that something that was best left alone has been unearthed? That's my impression of the Tomb of the Cybermen. After all the hype surrounding its discovery and release on video, and even before that, the whispers and rumors regarding its supposed godlike status in the world of Doctor Who, the genuine article was going to have a heck of a time living up to its reputation. Sad to say, folks, but a lot of you will feel cheated. What we have here is, on the whole, a fairly standard 60s Doctor Who story. And I know some of you who saw it as kids are disappointed with their second viewing. I did tone down some of the language there. Here's another snippet from a different review. Quote, "For the last 22 years, I have remembered the Tomb of the Cybermen as being a truly horrifying story. For a young lad of only 6, TV was real, and Tomb was pretty scary stuff then. Now, with the tomb having been uncovered, to coin a phrase, and being 22 years older, JNT's catchphrase, 'the memory cheats,' instantly springs to mind. The story of Tomb became familiar again in 1978, when Jerry Davis's superb novelization came out, and since then I've read the Titan script book and heard a very poor quality audio recording. But one very important factor was still missing, the visuals. As I read and heard my favorite scenes again and again, my childhood memories would spring to mind. But now I've finally seen the story once more, I'm somewhat disappointed. Don't get me wrong, Tomb is a marvelous story, but only in the tradition of 1960s Doctor Who. The first time I saw the video, I sat in awe, as I remembered watching this from the kitchen doorway. But on the second viewing a week later, the thrill had gone, and the story just looked like another product of 1960s television, with its wooden sets and wooden acting. It seems to me that the script writers had trouble writing the last episode. The story builds up to a dramatic climax in episode 1 to 3 with the reawakening of the Cybermen, but in episode 4, nothing happens. End quote. Not to be reductive, there are many other contemporary reviews of Tomb which paint the story in the most glowing terms, including in the Discontinuity Guide. But 2 years after 1992, one of the new adventures, Theatre of War by Justin Richards, a really good book, even if suffering slightly from first novel syndrome, has a plot that revolves in part around the recovery of a long lost classic play, which is then staged late in the book in the run up to the climax. Then the audience is disappointed that the play is not nearly as good as its reputation. It's impossible in 1994 to not read that plot element as a reaction to the return of Tomb of the Cybermen. So I asked the question for this podcast: from where did Tomb get its original reputation? The 1967 serial or the 1978 novelization? For many fans purchasing Doctor Who on VHS in 1992, or for me in 1993, or perhaps the DVD purchasers a decade or two later, they might never have seen the story in 1967. They might have known the story only from the novelization. And when you compare the novelization to the televised version, the novelization is really a novel with convincing geographic detail of the tombs that would have been impossible to realize in Lime Grove D. From the website of my friend Shannon Patrick Sullivan, A Brief History of Time Travel, here's a funny detail from the production of the story in the summer of '67. Shannon writes, quote, "The stuffy atmosphere of Studio D was now exacerbated by the summer heat, prompting Shirley Cookland to fall asleep while playing Captain's corpse, her castmates only realizing what had happened when she began snoring." Let's turn now to the novelization. This is Jerry Davis, returning to the scripts a little over a decade later, and with his keen novelist's eye and rich vocabulary, translating camera scripts and not writing for a limited budget or some less successful acting choices. The book begins, as did just about all Cybermen novelizations in the 1970s, with Davis's by now familiar The Creation of the Cybermen essay, which even showed up in Terrence Dicks's novelization of Revenge of the Cybermen, which itself was based only tangentially on a Jerry Davis script, which you can now hear as a Big Finish audio, co-starring friend of the podcast, Sadie Miller. To this essay, Davis adds two final paragraphs specific to this story, which expressly acknowledge the story's roots. Page 8. Until one day a party of archaeologists landed on the now barren and deserted planet of Telos. All they were after, they said, was to uncover and record the beginnings of the long-dead race of Cybermen, just as the tombs of ancient Egypt had been unearthed. But the tombs of the Cybermen were very different from the pyramids of the pharaohs. They held a terrible secret that was to convulse the universe and once again pit the Doctor against his most dreaded adversaries. Chapter 1 begins with a real-time look at the TARDIS's landing on Telos, which you would never have seen on TV in 1967. Quote, "On the large monitor screen, a small yellow circle of light was rapidly approaching. As the image enlarged and the detail became clearer, it was resolving into a small moon-like planet, pitted and scarred by light centuries of astral bombardment." That perhaps shows the influence of Star Wars, although I'm not sure when Jerry Davis might have seen the movie versus written this novelization. Chapter 1 is also a wardrobe changing scene for Victoria, in what now reads as somewhat sexist, to explain why Victoria goes from 1860s wear to a miniskirt. Davis tells us that it belonged to Polly first, which makes sense, but this isn't what happens on TV. The first scene on TV is a more lyrical introduction to the TARDIS, which sounds very much like it was written by Victor Pemberton as the script editor. This scene takes place on Scarrow, well, inside the TARDIS console room just before it takes off from Scarrow at the tail end of the Evil of the Daleks. This scene is not adapted for the book. Let's give a listen to the original.
There we are. Well, what do you think?
I don't know. Can't believe it. So big. Where are we?
Oh, it's the TARDIS. It's my home. At least it has been for a considerable number of years.
What are all these knobs?
What, these? Instruments. These are for controlling our flight.
Flight?
Well, yes. You see, we travel around in here through time and space. Oh, no. Don't laugh. It's true. Your father and Maxtable were working on the same problem, but I have perfected a rather special model, which enables me to travel through the universe of time.
How can you? I mean, if what you say is true, you must be, well... How old?
Well, if we count in Earth terms, I suppose I must be about 400... Yes, about 450 years old. Yes, well, quite. Now, I think Victoria might find that dress a little impracticable if she's going to join us in our adventures. Jamie, show her where she can find some new ones, will you?
Aye, right.
So this way, Victoria.
Try to give us a smooth takeoff, Doctor. We don't want to frighten her.
A smooth takeoff. A smooth takeoff? What a nerve!
The book might have been better off adapting the TV scene rather than spending so much time on Victoria's miniskirt, and it sets up a minor discontinuity, as Victoria later in the book knows the Doctor is 450 years old, the fact she learned in that first scene on TV, but not in the first scene in the book. The episode 1 material takes up a tremendous amount of real estate, nearly 50 pages. I haven't been keeping track of such things, maybe I should have, but this is, in publication order to date, probably the longest page count for any individual episode in any one Doctor Who novelization. I recall that Part 3 of Dragonfire will eventually beat that, but that's years away for us here on Doctor Who literature. Davis uses the extra page count to describe his settings and characters. In best Terrence Dicks style, he gives us a cutting sentence or two for each person. Toberman is, quote, the giant of the expedition. Viner is a thin, fussy little archaeologist. Captain has a fine-boned, beautiful Arabian face. I'm not making that up, that's actually the text. And she also has a liquid Middle Eastern voice, in case you didn't get the point. Professor Parry was the kind of man who was never at ease talking to a woman, unquote. Klieg is ugly, bald, strong, and stocky, full of tense force. Klieg in the book does not have an Arnold Schwarzenegger-sounding Austrian accent. George Rubisek's captain is described as having red hair, which in 1978 was obvious, as this was only a year after we saw Rubisek as an Imperial officer in the original Star Wars with red hair. As in Star Wars, Captain Hopper in the novelization has an American accent. Unlike in Star Wars, though, Rubisek's voice has not been dubbed, which, had it been dubbed for Tomb of the Cybermen, may have saved us some interesting line readings. In the book, Hopper is said to whisper the line, "Man, you just blew yourself a pair of doors," which, bless him, is not how Rubisek delivered the line on television. The doors to the tombs have a strange blue sheen, and Jamie also has red hair, in the book at least. Convincing detail for the adaptation of a monochrome production. Now, just to build on my discussion with Stephen B. earlier, I do want to bring up the question as to whether or not this book is a product of its time in terms of now dated racial expressions. Viner and Captain were both played on television by Jewish actors. Jewish actors were routinely cast as others in 1960s Doctor Who. The book does not allow Viner or Captain to have much dignity. In case you missed it, Viner is called Little 3 times in Chapter 3 alone, and then more later. Captain is described as inscrutable, Chapter 3 and Chapter 6. And as for Toberman, played on TV by a black actor, Roy Stewart, who came back on the show 4 seasons later to play a similar role in Terror of the Autons. The book doesn't specifically say that Toberman is of African origin, but on page 24 he is described as a dark giant, and he is described as menacing, quote unquote. These are not words that you use to introduce a tragic hero, that's for sure, and the use of these words bothers me now in a way that I would not have recognized in the mid-1980s when I was still a tween. Patrick Troughton's Doctor enters the story proper in Chapter 3, page 17. His voice has, quote, a note in it that made the men stop arguing and turn to him. He has cat-like green eyes and speaks, quote, in a voice of quiet authority. He also has, quote, the bright, irritating voice that adults use to settle children's quarrels. Davis calls him Doctor Who twice in this chapter, which I'm sure made a big impression on young Stephen Moffat. Davis gives an early hint of the book's violence content by telling us on page 19 that the electrocuted Q member's corpse is now stiffening, and a dark bit of comedy. Quote, the archaeologists had momentarily forgotten the dead man. It interfered with their work. There's a great description of Jamie trying to open the heavy tomb doors on page 23. He writes, surely there couldn't be a weight in the world, in the universe, that strong Jamie couldn't shift? He pulled again, angrily, his heart thumping, and the muscles in his neck standing out like wood. Of course he could do it. He, Jamie of the Highlands. Jamie who pulled redcoats off their horses at Culloden and tossed them into the gullies. But even he could not move the terrible doors one fraction of a millimeter. And an even more interesting paragraph about the Doctor on page 25, one I could have sworn I've never noticed before. Even the Doctor allowed fear to show on his face, but as always, for a very different reason from everyone else. That's a pretty dark sentence, if you think about it. What you won't find in the book is some of the byplay and nonverbal humor devised on location or in rehearsal. The famous bit where the Doctor and Jamie accidentally hold hands while entering the tombs for the first time, each thinking they're taking Victoria's hand, is not here. Just as well, that would probably look pretty clumsy in print. In terms of screen-to-script adaptation, this is pretty nearly what we got on TV, word for word and in scene order, with the notable exception of that different first TARDIS scene. In Chapter 2, there's an extra beat where there's a roll call of all the rocket crew and the scientific expedition to make sure that nobody's caught in the blasting zone. In Chapter 3, there's an extra beat where the Doctor discovers that there's metal sheeting under the topsoil on Telos, which conducted the electricity that killed the crew member. These beats help give the book a more cinematic and novelistic feel. You can see there wouldn't be enough time on TV for that sort of business, but any extra scenes for the book are always a bonus for me. It's once we get inside the tomb proper, Chapter 4, that you can see what Davis really had in mind for the tombs to look and feel like. He's writing here for the big screen, or better, for the mind's eye, and not for Lime Grove D in a last story of the production block budget crunch. Though to be fair, Morris Barry's production is very ambitious for its day, as we'll talk about later. Let's take a look at the first paragraph of Chapter 4, and we'll see how Jerry Davis describes the tombs. The light of the Doctor's torch showed a dark passage leading directly into the crater wall. Once inside, the cold dark of the tomb seemed to cling to them, as if the place could never be warm or no sunlight. Cautiously they walked along the entrance passage, their footsteps muffled in fine ancient dust that had sifted through the minute crack of the entrance doors. Not very long, but man, you can feel the cold air, and you can feel the dark. There's no doubt about what the tombs look like when you're reading the book, and what you're envisioning is not the sets from the TV production. Quote, they were in a vast chamber, gleaming, as if the rock it was cut from was a kind of metal. Now on page 28, we get even more detail than that. Around the room, above the computer controls, marched a gigantic procession of Cybermen bas-reliefs, as large as the Cybermen themselves, glistening in the slightly phosphorescent metal. They loomed in frightening order, a march of exactly similar beings. As Victoria's space torch shone onto first one and then another, they seemed to move, to bulge slightly towards her, and then sink back as her torch found the next one. Cybermen marched across space between planets. They marched over a rubble of tiny crushed people. They climbed out of their long, cigar-shaped spaceships, and in one bas-relief, two whirling worlds spun so close to each other, they seemed to clash. There's more. I won't read it all, but I suspect that this set of passages here, primarily pages 28 and 29, is why certain reviewers were disappointed to watch the story back in 1992. because their minds remembered this level of detail and realism. Oh wait, I'll give you one more. Page 29. Yes, in those dynasties they still had many human traits, continued the professor, staring at the ancient carved figure, as if it could tell him the truth about what happened when a man changed to a Cyberman. Although it was human, already the figure had a pose as stiff as the Cybermen, and already it was encased in metal and plastic. But you could see the shape of human muscles in the thighs and calves, and there was still a face behind the helmet, although a blank face. What had that man thought? Had he realized what was already happening to him? The transition from man to machine? That's pretty incredible. That's a level of body horror with the Cybermen that you really don't get again, arguably, until maybe Attack of the Cybermen or the new series. But Davis is giving us a much grimmer view of the cyber conversion process than you would have gotten anywhere else on television in the 1960s and 70s. Davis also adds overt references to the 10th Planet, the first Cyberman story, to keep continuity going. Not for him, the parallel evolution theory of Stephen Moffat's Cybermen. These are all in a linear progression time-wise and all from the same place. There's lots more dialogue in Chapter 4 than in the corresponding TV scenes. Then Victoria is described pretty assertively, fittingly for an episode that features really strong work from Debbie Watling. Victoria is no shy Victorian miss, we're told in Chapter 4, top of page 34. Victoria didn't say that they need have no fear even without Toberman. She came from a lively Victorian family, brought up by an unconventional scientist father. And it didn't really surprise her to find they were fuddy-duddies in the future centuries as well, who thought women always needed men to protect them. What they needed were brains, and if necessary, weapons, she thought to herself. But she was pleased that Captain was coming with her. She had been very struck by Captain's great beauty and self-assurance, and the way even the truculent Klieg seemed to defer to her. On page 37, Victoria reveals that her father, the Victorian scientist, was friends with Michael Faraday, the father of applied electricity. Oh, and we learned that Faraday did not like carrots. Well, nobody's perfect. The description of Jamie on page 39 also helps address a point that Toby Hadoke and Rob Shearman made about Jamie in their Running Through Corridors essays on this story. That from this story onward, Jamie stops being an actual man from 1746 and starts being Fraser Hines. Davis bridges that gap on page 39. Every day since he'd met the doctor, Davis writes, he'd been surrounded with such a forest of things that he didn't understand. He found that by keeping his mouth shut and saying, "Oh, aye, that," in an offhand voice, whenever people started mentioning such things, he could fool them into believing he knew what they were talking about. It usually worked. In Chapter 5 is a very important line of dialogue delivered by the doctor. That happens to be one of the only lines of dialogue in this chapter that was not delivered on TV. Don't you wonder why there, that is to say the Cybermen, codes fit exactly the stage of mathematical knowledge you and your friends have arrived at? This is said to Klieg, who's trying to work out the mathematical equations that will turn on the power supply in the tombs. This tells us how we know the doctor realizes the tombs are a trap, an intelligence test, long before we're told this on TV. The doctor spends a lot of time in the book being described as hanging around in the background, looking worried, or acting on his own agenda. This sentence tells us exactly why. The real Cybermen, had they built tombs, would have designed those tombs to their mathematical or engineering level, not that of inferior humans from the 25th century, or whenever. The TV story hints at this, but the book connects the dots, and still in part 1, the best time to give the reader and the audience that information. Davis never misses an opportunity to add background to his characters, well, except for Hayden, the first named character to die. On page 45 is a vivid, if perhaps slightly patronizing view of Jamie. Now, if there was one thing Jamie didn't like, says Davis, it was darkness. Darkness was full of hobgoblins who led your horse into the bog, or footpads who robbed and dirked you before you had time to hit back. No one in Jamie's village stayed out after dark if they had any sense. He didn't know he was clutching onto Hayden's arm. And page 47, in the run-up to the episode 1 cliffhanger, lists all the hypnotic colors on the wall of the Cyberman target room that you couldn't see in black and white. Crimson, rose color, scarlet, vermilion, orange, yellow, green, blue, royal blue, ultramarine, violet, purple, deep purple, and back to dark, dark red. The Cybermen appear to have discovered the rainbow. This is part of a general trend in Chapter 6, which has lots more dialogue in every scene compared to the TV product, like Jamie needing the concept of hypnotism explained to him, or the Doctor more directly threatening Captain than he did on television. Davis casts Professor Parry in villainous terms, which I find somewhat interesting. Parry is not a supremely well-written role, but he is acted sympathetically on TV. But on page 51, Davis writes, "The professor felt that the death of the crewmen at the doors would be somehow justified if they found the great archaeological treasure they were seeking, a find that would make Professor Parry the outstanding archaeologist of his time." The episode 1 cliffhanger is one of the earlier moments on TV that provoked a laugh-out-loud reaction from my college classmates early in 1993. The clearly empty Cyberman suit sliding out of the wall. Davis, however, pictures it in blockbuster terms. And of course, no TV production, no matter what good work Morris Barry was doing for 1967, could measure up. Page 53. As he spoke, the far wall seemed to lose its light and grow dark. They saw it was not a wall. It was doors, silently gliding open. Out of the blackness loomed a huge figure, a silvery apparition with gigantic limbs and a massive helmet for a face. Victoria screamed. Behind her, Viner, who had just entered the room, stopped, aghast, his mouth open. But the silver figure, with the blank face, raised its metal fist, and in its fist was something like a gun, black and menacing. Every human stood there, mesmerized with fear. The Cyberman went on raising his gun, slowly, slowly. It was pointing at them. They could see the dark hole of the barrel. Down! The Doctor pulled Victoria to the ground, followed by Jamie and Viner. Flash! There was a cry of agony. Lying on the floor, they saw Hayden twitching, his eyes wide. Out of his tunic at his neck, arms, and legs poured smoke, thick yellow smoke. Almost in slow motion, his body crumpled up, and he fell to the ground, his eyes open, staring. Hayden is not given a proper introduction until his eulogy on page 56. Professor Parry remembering him as an eager young student who volunteered to join the expedition. Then a really dark thought on page 59, after the Doctor explains the target room setup and recovers the deadly weapon. Quote, "Once he had explained it, they relaxed, but Hayden was still dead." You can tell Captain Hopper is American, in case the book hadn't belabored the point already, because he uses the word crummy to describe Telos in the final paragraph of that chapter. Though the book replaces "some character has balled up a lot" with the slightly more appropriate "some character has messed up a lot." With a movie producer's eye, and that's what he was later on, Jerry Davis takes a breather at the top of Chapter 8, in a moment that didn't exist on TV, for a gorgeous B-roll establishing shot. Quote, "Hours later, the outer surface of Telos was dark and silent. Nothing moved. The remote stars of other galaxies shone in the clear atmosphere, but gave only a sliver of light on the dark crater mountains." Now compare with 1985's Attack of the Cybermen, which did have these B-roll shots on TV, but the pictures there are not nearly as evocative as Davis's prose here. I say movie producer, and I mean this as a compliment. This novelization really does feel more like a movie treatment than most of the previous Terrence novelizations. There is liberal use of italics or all capital letters to emphasize certain bits of speech or sound effects. The tombs open with an all capital letters crash, and the emphases on special effects, such as page 68. Cautiously, the humans moved forward to look. They felt a death-like chill of ice which took away their breath. A steam of condensation seethed above the opening as the warmer air above met the chill tomb air. On the underside of the lid, huge stalactites of ice spiked out like bayonets, and a brilliant rime sparkled on the metal ladder, leading down to the black subterranean depths. Page 69 has an unexpected bit of feminism from the older male author. Quote, "The Doctor was never anything less than fair. It came from a time when no one believed women incapable of doing even the toughest and most hazardous jobs." There's also a menu on page 71, before Victoria is disappointed to learn about the freeze-dried astronaut food of the late 1960s and 70s. She envisions, quote, "a plate weighed down with an enormous drumstick, tasty white meat and stuffing, onion sauce, Brussels sprouts, and roast potatoes. Man, you throw in some cranberry sauce, and it's Happy Thanksgiving, Charlie Brown. As short as some of the earlier chapters are, Chapter 8 is an incredible 26 pages long, and it contains lots more detail than on TV. The Doctor again notes that not only are the cyber control panels in the underground tombs conveniently labeled in human symbolic logic, but that in the book, the control levers are designed to fit human as opposed to Cybermen hands. Viner's annoying nature, and the fact that he's little and wears glasses, I resemble that remark, is given an interesting counterpoint in his death scene, allowing the character one and only one moment of dignity in the seconds before he dies. Page 81. The little man, whose nagging anxieties and complaints had got on the nerves of his companions throughout the expedition, now showed an unexpected reserve of will and courage. He stared unflinchingly into the mouth of the leveled gun. Put that away. You can't intimidate me. Does not happen quite that way on television. I will also point out here that Kaftan is described as an Arab about as many times as Viner is described as little, which is to say, too many times. If you recall back from episode 22 of this podcast, where we discussed the novelization of Revenge of the Cybermen, those 1975-era Cybermen are my Cybermen. My default mental image of the Cybermen all have those 1970s helmets and Christopher Robbie's voice. I suspect that Jerry Davis, the author of the story that eventually became Revenge, felt the same way. When I first saw the cyber controller from this story on TV on that winter's day in early 1993, I recall being disappointed that the costume did not match what Davis describes here in print. Black helmet with a chest unit, neither of which were on the TV costume, and the controller's voice is described on page 89 as a low, vibrating chord, which isn't what was heard on TV in 1967.
You belong to us. You shall be like us.
While I prefer the voices in my head to the voices in my head, let me rephrase that. While I prefer the way I picture the voices in my head to the voices on television, there is one line in the book not on TV that I do appreciate. Klieg states his delusional belief that the Cybermen, who've been dormant for 500 years, may have heard of him. Up till now, and you'll notice this is my longest book breakdown, this is normally the point where I'm done, and as my critics will cheerfully point out, this is really saying something if this is considered my longest one. It's taken 82 pages in the book to reach the episode 2 cliffhanger, the halfway point to the story. The book only runs 135 pages, so it's clear that Davis is going to have to do some compressing to fit in episodes 3 and 4. The scene where Victoria fetches Captain Hopper and Jim Callum to open the hatch in the book features the captain calling Victoria a little lady. That is not spoken on TV, thankfully, but the scene does extend to give Victoria the last word by having her speak, quote, in a voice every bit as cool and cutting as her father's when he was about to demolish an academic colleague. Cut out of the book is a brief exchange between Victoria and Captain Hopper after he refuses to let her accompany her down below, where he calls her honey. Better in the book is the addition that Victoria's scream early in episode 3 is a calculated ploy to distract the gun-wielding captain, which is not indicated as such on television. Professor Parry continues to be, well, a dope, if not delusional. Chapter 9, quote, to find Cybermen in tombs was an archaeological triumph, but to find Cybermen rising from the dead and taking over the universe, that was something quite different. He wanted to get away as soon as possible while his rolls of film were still intact. Wow. Let's say that again, but slower. While his rolls of film were still intact. You know, never minding that Hayden's been killed by a cyber weapon, or that Viner's been shot dead by Klieg, and Parry's the only member left of his academic team. Nope, his primary thought is for his rolls of film. Michael Crichton's techno-thriller novels are full of characters like Professor Parry, and almost none of them survive, as Crichton books tend to kill off characters as moral judgments from on high. Parry is lucky to survive the story, though of course we're only midway through the episode 3 material in my breakdown, so Parry is not out of danger yet. What's interesting is that Davis doesn't remove any scenes or significant chunks of dialogue, even while the second half of the story is told in much fewer pages than the first half, unlike the similarly sized novelization of Talons of Wang-Chiang, which I discussed with Kate and John back in episode 37. This means that Davis adapts the complete Victor Pemberton scene between the Doctor and Victoria. You know, one of the greatest classic series scenes of all time. Let's play it first. Though anyone listening to this rather niche Doctor Who podcast is probably the type of fan who's already got it memorized. And if you're not that kind of fan, welcome. Hope you're enjoying the show.
Hey, why didn't you wake me? I should have been on watch half an hour ago.
I thought you should rest.
Why me?
No reason, really.
Oh, I think I know. Is it because I'm...
Well, if you are 450 years old, you need a great deal of sleep.
Well, that's very considerate of you, Victoria, but between you and me, I'm really quite lively, actually, all things being considered. Are you happy with us, Victoria?
Yes, I am. At least, I would be if my father were here.
Yes, I know.
I wonder what he would have thought if he could see me now.
You miss him very much, don't you?
It's only when I close my eyes. I can still see him standing there before those horrible Dalek creatures came to the house. He was a very kind man. I shall never forget him. Never.
No, of course you won't. But, you know, the memory of him won't always be a sad one.
I think it will. You can't understand being so ancient.
Eh?
I mean old.
Oh.
You probably can't remember your family.
Oh, yes, I can when I want to. And that's the point, really. I have to really want to bring them back in front of my eyes. The rest of the time, they sleep in my mind, and I forget. And so will you. Oh, yes, you will. You'll find there's so much else to think about, to remember. Our lives are different to anybody else's. That's the exciting thing. Nobody in the universe can do what we're doing. We must get some sleep and let this poor old man stay awake.
Davis really explores the studio space while adapting the scene, giving us extra emotions and feelings, on top of Pemberton's wise words. This about Victoria, for example, page 111. Plucked suddenly from her comfortable home in the Victorian age, to cope alone with people and places centuries ahead, she kept her affections and used her intelligence remarkably well. You'd do well in life if that was your gravestone epitaph, but for Doctor Who, just another Saturday night in the late summer of 1967. Davis also adds some words to Pemberton's "There's nobody else in the universe" speech, though it'll be the TV words that I remember years from now, rather than the books. Meanwhile, Troughton and Fraser Hines' little byplay over the complete metal breakdown, almost certainly an ad-lib, is not in the book, and as Haydock and Shearman pointed out, the historical Jamie, had there been one, would likely not have appreciated the mental/metal play on words. The episode 4 material is largely confined to the last 3 chapters. Much of the text here revolves not around the Cybermen or their equipment, but about Klieg's madness. Davis uses many variations on lines such as this from page 119, quote, "To the others, he sounded like a child telling the waves not to fall, but Klieg was completely lost to reason." Many Doctor Who villains act like this over the years, especially in the classic series, and Klieg is not the most interesting example of the bunch, but Davis also describes how the Cyber Controller's voice changes as it exhausts in energy, quote, "no longer a magnificent array of chords," and how cold the metal surface of the Cyber Controller feels when the Doctor touches it. And that material helps make up for Klieg not being a particularly interesting antagonist. While the episode 1 material ran for nearly 50 pages, and while the episode 4 material, by contrast, runs for barely 25, Davis didn't cut any TV scenes or significant bits of dialogue to make the final episode fit into that compressed space. In fact, he gives Capstan an extra line in Chapter 12 about her plans for world domination, saying here in more detail than she did on TV, quote, "We are going to build a much, much better world than there has ever been, responsive to the laws of pure logic." The use of the word Turk to describe Toberman, which so fascinated Stephen and me earlier in the program, doesn't show up for the first time until page 128. And on page 129, Toberman is described as an ex-wrestler, Davis saving the most vivid bits of characterization for Toberman until the last 10 pages. I think those two references explain just why I used to picture Toberman as a bald white guy with a handlebar mustache, dressed in a black wrestling singlet, by the way. The first big change in the climactic chapter 13 is that where on TV the Doctor declines Jamie's offer of a gun by saying, "I shan't need that," in the book 11 years later, the Doctor says a more characteristic, "Never use the things." The last 2 pages are spectacular, and I will not read them all out loud here, but lines like Toberman dying in front of the doors which he had, quote, closed with his life, or the Doctor sadly greeting a crushed Professor Parry with a rare, ancient, 450-year-old smile. The biggest deletion from TV is that there is no last-minute surviving Cybermat exiting onto the surface of Telos to begin the whole cyber life cycle anew. And the book works better ending on the Doctor's final words, rather than with the cliched "one monster survives" ending. What's the outcome of my journey with Tomb? Watching it in a college dorm with a bunch of American kids who viewed the story as a comically dated historical relic, it was hard for me early in 1993 to not be somewhat disappointed that Tomb didn't look like, say, James Cameron's Aliens or Irvin Kershner's The Empire Strikes Back, or even Nicholas Meyer's Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. But then in 2013, the first time I tried to watch Doctor Who as a pilgrimage, I was struck by another revelation. Watching the show not as an out-of-order jukebox single, but as the most recent episode of a series that I've been watching evolve day by day from November 1963, here's what I said in a Facebook post on January 5th, 2014. The dialogue in Tomb is pretty rapid-fire. Watched in succession after weak scripts for Faceless Ones and the very dull stretch in the middle of Evil of the Daleks, it's finally a script that I'm engaging with rather than just sitting through. Also, I'm quite impressed with director Maurice Barry's visual flair, given that it was the final story of the production season and shoehorned into Little Lime Grove Studio D. He does a lot with film inserts and back projection. While the visual feel is still a letdown compared to both the Tomb novelization and how Doctor Who looks on TV today, it's still pretty epic when watched in sequence, especially one of the 17 episodes before this. 14 of them were recons, so part of it is the sheer joy of getting to watch moving images again. I'll point out that I wrote that before most of the Season 4 animations came out. I love Tomb of the Cybermen. I love the TV series story, although it did not have the warmest reception in certain corners of fandom when it was recovered. I think it is rightly a classic for the way that it's written, for the way that it is produced in the context of its time, for its direction and acting. I think the novelization, as you can tell by the fact that I've devoted a lot more space to it than usual for this podcast, is really, really terrific. I do have some qualms with some of the way that characters are described in terms of appearance or race or ethnicity, and some of the language is not particularly fully feminist, but this was written again in 1978. Had Davis been around for the past 30 years, and were he adapting the book for the first time now, I am positive that he would have made some different choices, and that would have erased any of the few qualms that I have with the book that we're left with. Next time on Doctor Who Literature, after a long run of Tom Baker era books set during season 14, and then with Horror of Fang Rock season 15, we're suddenly in the middle of an 8-month run with few books, only 3 published in 1978 between March and November, and all of them are past Doctor's adventures. We follow this one second Doctor story with a pair of late Pertwee epics. The summer of 78, June and July, would be a cool Doctor summer for Target, with novelizations of stories televised as part of Season 11. Join us for the next 2 weeks with one returning guest and one new guest as we tackle the Time Warrior and Death to the Daleks next time on Doctor Who Literature. Thank you for joining me on another episode of the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. I'm Jason, your host and editor and producer. Special thanks to my special guest, Stephen B. from the New to Who podcast. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at anchor.fm/Doctor Who Lit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe, or leave a review like Fraser. You can find me on Twitter at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels, and under the hashtag Doctor Who Pilgrimage, that's Dr. Who Pilgrimage, or on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature@gmail.com. I love getting your emails, and I will read them on the air. Please drop me a line with your comments, your questions, your suggestions. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.